Night settled over the forested ridges like a heavy curtain, muffling every distant sound and swallowing the last traces of daylight. Along a forgotten dirt road, a thin line of exhausted infantry dug in among tangled roots and frost-hardened leaves, knowing that an armored column was moving toward them. They had no heavy guns, no anti-tank reserves, and no time. All they had was the darkness, their fear, and a few crates of mines that were never meant to save a line this thin. The officers knew it. The men knew it. The road ahead felt like a death sentence waiting for its signature. Among the soldiers crouched a quiet, sharp-minded corporal whose job was normally just to place mines by the book, but the book no longer mattered. He studied the road, the slope, and the pattern of enemy movement, realizing that the expected attack would crush them in minutes. A traditional minefield wouldn't slow armored vehicles long enough. Standard placements would be cleared or rolled over before making any difference. He needed something the enemy would not anticipate, something irregular, something reckless, something that would buy his platoon just one more hour of life. What he came up with in that freezing dusk was so unconventional that even his own men hesitated to help him lay it down. He planted the mines backwards, turned the pattern inside out, and wired the triggers in a way no manual endorsed. It looked wrong. It looked useless. It looked like desperation sculpted in steel. But in a war where logic collapsed under the weight of necessity, his idea became the thin thread that held back disaster. That night, as engines approached and headlights cut through the trees, the road transformed into a trap that would tear an entire convoy apart. The forest pressed in close on both sides of the road, the trees standing like silent witnesses to the chaos about to unfold. The corporal moved along the frozen mud with a deliberate pace, listening to the forest breathe around him. Each step carried the weight of knowing that the wrong placement, the wrong angle, or the wrong assumption could doom the entire line. Yet he couldn't ignore what he'd seen earlier that week. Enemy engineers clearing minefields with practiced ease, their armored rollers crushing everything in their path. He needed a solution that didn't look like a solution. He studied the slope on the right side of the road, where the earth dipped into a shallow trench before climbing again. This was the kind of terrain that funneled vehicles into predictable paths. He crouched near the embankment and dragged his gloved hand along the soil, feeling for firmness. The ground was hard enough to support a detour, but soft enough to hide pressure plates. The idea formed fully in his mind. If he planted the mines facing inward, toward where vehicles would swerve to avoid obvious placements, he could turn their evasive maneuvers into fatal mistakes. Behind him, distant artillery thumped, shaking loose dust from the branches overhead. The men assigned to help him watched with a mixture of confusion and quiet trust, waiting for instructions. He pointed to the trench, explaining only that the devices would function best if the enemy believed the road ahead was hazardous in a different way. He didn't waste words. He simply began to dig, each motion steady and unhurried, as though he had rehearsed this strange pattern 100 times before. The others followed, not understanding the full logic, but knowing instinctively that he did. Night deepened as they worked, cold air settling into the grooves of the forest and clinging to their uniforms. The corporal knelt beside a mine, rotating it in his hands until the detonator faced the slope instead of the road. The position looked absurd. Combat engineers were trained to avoid this exact orientation because it reduced forward effectiveness. But tonight, the forward direction wasn't the goal. He needed sideways force. Mines that traditionally targeted weight from above would instead strike from the flank when vehicles shifted to avoid the trap they thought they saw. To reinforce the deception, he had the men scatter branches and leaves across sections of the main path to simulate a hasty blocking attempt. It was a crude illusion, but in the darkness it would trick drivers into believing the center of the road was seeded with mines. The armored column, seeing this, would veer toward the trench where the real danger waited. He spread the pattern like an inverted net, each device angled toward the predictable detour point. The formation broke every rule. It also created kill zones no standard minefield could match. Fog rolled through the trees, thickening the air and dampening the sound of distant engines. The moon hid behind heavy clouds as the temperature continued to fall. The corporal brushed soil over the last device, pressing it gently into place before stepping back to inspect the field. Nothing about it looked correct, but to him, the pattern made perfect sense, a puzzle solved by intuition rather than instruction. He wiped his gloves on his jacket, exhaled into the cold, and signaled that the line should fall back to their positions. Their fate, for better or worse, was now locked beneath the dirt. The men took cover among the trees, the forest floor crunching softly beneath their boots. The corporal settled behind a fallen log, his eyes fixed on the dark ribbon of road he had reshaped into a trap. He listened to the night, the slow pulse of wind through branches, the distant metallic echo of engines moving closer. Every sound pressed into his nerves. He felt no pride in what he had built, only the weight of responsibility that came with it. A faint vibration trembled through the ground, barely noticeable, but unmistakable to anyone who had lived through armored assaults. He pressed a hand to the soil and felt it again. The enemy column was entering the forest. Time stretched thin as the headlights began to flicker through the distant trees. He whispered a silent hope that his calculations were correct, that the deceptive blocking debris would be seen, that the angled mines would strike true. The line's survival hung on moments that were rapidly approaching. He adjusted his footing and steadied his breathing as the first armored vehicle rolled into view, its engine growling low. The headlights swept across the road, illuminating the scattered branches he had laid earlier. The driver hesitated, just as he predicted. The vehicle edged toward the trench, guided by the illusion he had crafted. The corporal felt the ground tremble harder beneath him. If his backward mine pattern worked, everything would change within seconds. If it failed, nothing would stop what was coming. The lead vehicle eased into the trench-side path, its tracks grinding into the soft soil. The corporal watched from the shadows as the weight shifted exactly where he intended. Then, with a sound that tore through the silence, the first mine detonated sideways into the vehicle's hull. The explosion ripped upward and inward, flipping debris across the trees. The shockwave pulsed through the forest floor, sending birds scattering into the dark sky. For a heartbeat, the column froze. Headlights jerked, engines stalled, and the line behind the lead vehicle compressed in confusion. Some drivers attempted to reverse. Others swerved even harder toward the trench, trying to avoid what they believed was the mined center of the road. The backward pattern trapped them. One after another, vehicles rolled into the kill zone, each detonation triggered by sideways force as they attempted evasive maneuvers. The road lit up in bursts of fire and dust. The forest echoed with metallic shrieks as armor split and wheels tore free. The second, third, and fourth vehicles vanished in a chain of explosions. The corporal counted each one with grim precision, knowing that shock and panic were doing half the work. The unconventional layout created a cascading effect. Drivers kept avoiding what they assumed was danger, only to plunge directly into it. Smoke drifted between the trees, glowing orange from the fires chewing through metal. The corporal remained perfectly still, watching shapes struggle in the chaos. Engines coughed and roared. A transport truck attempted a desperate shortcut across the embankment, only to hit a mine angled beneath a cluster of roots. The blast hurled the vehicle sideways, its frame twisting before collapsing into the dirt. Another detonation cracked the night as a half-track skidded on debris and slid into the kill zone. Within minutes, the convoy's formation dissolved. Vehicles bunched together, colliding in the darkness as the sideways blasts punched through thin undercarriages. The path that should have offered them a safe retreat instead funneled them deeper into danger. The corporal's pattern exploited panic as effectively as steel. Each explosion pushed drivers to make the exact choices that would destroy them. Through the smoke, he saw silhouettes scrambling from damaged vehicles. Some shouted, trying to reorganize in the chaos. The forest swallowed their voices. The line of soldiers hidden among the trees held their breath, waiting for any sign that the convoy might regain control. But the explosions continued, shaking the ground like distant thunder. The trap was working far beyond what anyone had dared to believe. The 10th explosion tore through the stillness, a bright plume of fire lifting from beneath the remains of a transport truck. The corporal noted the detonation point and knew the pattern had reached its middle arc. The remaining mines were positioned deeper along the trench, where congestion would push the last vehicles into the kill zone without hesitation. He shifted slightly to improve his view, though he already understood the sequence unfolding. A final armored car tried to force its way through, smashing aside debris with desperate speed. It angled wide, trying to escape the burning wrecks, exactly where the corporal had predicted a frightened driver would go. The mine he placed backwards beneath the shallow bend detonated with brutal precision, tearing open the undercarriage and flipping the vehicle onto its side. Flames washed across the road, illuminating the shattered curve of steel. The corporal exhaled slowly. 14 vehicles had been destroyed in total, each one falling victim to decisions the drivers believed were rational in the darkness. Panic, confusion, and instinct had become part of the trap. He lowered his head for a moment, understanding the terrible efficiency of what he had done. Nothing about the pattern was natural, yet it had worked with uncanny force, because it turned human reaction into a weapon. The fires burned for nearly an hour, their glow pulsing across the treetops. The men of the line watched the scene unfold with a mixture of relief and disbelief. They had expected to be overrun before they could even raise their rifles. Instead, the forest was filled with the clatter of collapsing metal and the roar of flames licking at fuel tanks. The corporal stayed silent, listening for any sign of a renewed assault. As the flames dimmed, the forest returned to stillness. Smoke coiled upward through the branches, carrying the acrid scent of burnt fuel. The corporal stepped from cover and moved cautiously toward the edge of the road. The destruction was devastating. Twisted vehicles blocking every escape route, shattered wheels scattered in the mud. The trench glowed with embers where several detonations had overlapped, carving deep scars into the earth. The men joined him, spreading out along the ruined path. Their faces showed exhaustion, relief, and something else: respect. The corporal didn't draw attention to himself. He simply walked between the wrecks, examining each point of impact with a mechanic's precision. He confirmed that his backward pattern had triggered exactly as intended, each angled charge striking from the side with maximum effect. The road that once threatened them was now a barrier protecting their flank. Dawn crept through the forest, its pale light cutting through lingering smoke. The men took relief in the warming air as they prepared for the next phase of the fight. Though battered and weary, they knew they had gained something precious: time. The delay caused by the destroyed convoy would halt enemy momentum and give their division a chance to reorganize. The corporal understood that this momentary pause could alter the wider battle unfolding miles away. He walked along the upper ridge and surveyed the landscape with tired eyes. The forest stretched ahead, silent and shrouded in morning mist. Birds slowly returned to the branches, tentative at first. The corridor of wrecked vehicles looked unreal in the early light, as though the night's violence had been a fever dream. But the impact marks, the metal fragments in the mud, and the deep craters told the truth. The corporal lowered himself onto a stump, letting his breath steady. He didn't think of the number of vehicles destroyed or the tactical significance. He simply accepted that his gamble had worked. Improvisation born from necessity had held the line, and the responsibility of that weighed heavily on him. He rubbed the cold from his hands, unsure whether the tremor he felt came from fatigue or from the knowledge of how close they had come to collapse. Reinforcements arrived by midday, moving through the forest with cautious steps as they took in the destruction. Officers inspected the scene, their expressions shifting from disbelief to admiration as they traced the mine pattern. The layout defied conventional doctrine, yet its effectiveness was undeniable. They questioned the corporal with calm precision, asking him to explain the logic behind each angle and placement. He described the terrain, the expected reaction of drivers, and the deceptive blocking technique he had used. His voice remained even, as though reciting a simple procedural report. The officers nodded along, realizing that the success lay not in brute force, but in psychology, a rare use of minds to influence movement rather than merely punish it. They recorded every detail, knowing that such a tactic could prove invaluable in similar terrain. Yet the corporal felt no triumph. He knew that desperate improvisation did not translate easily into doctrine. Conditions had aligned perfectly: terrain, darkness, panic, and enemy overconfidence. Replicating such success would be difficult, perhaps impossible. But for this forest, on this night, against this column, the backward pattern had been exactly what survival required. As the sun rose higher, teams moved to clear the remaining debris. The corporal helped where he could, prying twisted panels from the mud and guiding others around unstable wrecks. Occasionally, he paused to run his fingers along the ridges of a blast crater, understanding how the pressure had dispersed through the earth. It was the kind of quiet analysis only a combat engineer could appreciate. Nearby, younger soldiers watched him with quiet admiration. They whispered about the night, repeating the story with growing reverence. But he paid little attention to their words. He knew that reputation meant little compared to the weight of responsibility that came with shaping life-or-death outcomes. What mattered was that the line still held, and that the men around him would live to face another day. In the distance, the rumble of friendly armor could be heard approaching from the main road. Their arrival signaled a shift, a transition from desperate defense to renewed strength. The corporal stood and brushed dirt from his gloves, preparing for whatever came next. He had no expectation of recognition, only the quiet satisfaction that he had fulfilled his role when it mattered most. By late afternoon, the forest had begun to feel like a different place entirely. Sunlight filtered through the branches, casting long beams across the wreckage. The once deadly road now resembled a barrier wall, its destroyed vehicles forming a jagged line of protection. The corporal walked along its length, observing how the battlefield had transformed with the changing light. Smoke curled lazily from the shattered engines, mingling with the scent of pine and damp earth. The night's violence seemed almost distant now, fading beneath the calm rhythm of the forest. The corporal paused near the first crater and closed his eyes, recalling the tension he had felt when the convoy approached, the moment the first detonation shattered the silence, and the cascading chain that followed. It all felt surreal in the quiet daylight. He opened his eyes and continued walking, knowing that this small patch of earth would be remembered by those who fought here. Not because of heroism in the traditional sense, but because a single idea, one born from necessity, fear, and intuition, had reshaped the outcome of a battle. The corporal accepted this quietly, without expectation of reward. Survival was reward enough. As evening approached, orders came for the unit to move deeper into the forest to secure a new defensive position. The corporal gathered his equipment, careful to pack each tool with the same precision he had shown on the night of the ambush. Before leaving, he turned back toward the road, studying the line of ruined vehicles one last time. The forest was returning to silence, but the scars carved into the earth would remain for months, maybe years. Walking away, he felt the weight of exhaustion settling into his muscles. Yet beneath that fatigue rested something stronger, a quiet confidence shaped by experience. War often demanded impossible decisions, and sometimes survival depended on ideas that defied convention. He had learned that truth the hard way. The forest had tested him, and he had answered with ingenuity that no manual could teach. As night settled once more over the ridges, the corporal joined his unit on the march. The road behind them lay in ruin. The path ahead was uncertain. But he moved forward with steady determination, knowing that the line still held because he had dared to see the battlefield differently. And somewhere in the dense, fire-scarred forest, the echoes of 14 destroyed vehicles whispered the legacy of one backward minefield that changed everything.